So we're going to get started by talking about what intersectionality is. It was originally coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. She is an amazing American lawyer, professor, advocate, and a leading scholar on critical race theory. She's defined it, as a quote from her from last year, as the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exasperate each other. So basically the overlapping of multiple oppressions and identities, which then creates different experiences of discrimination and oppression and privilege. So each of these things like race, education, sexuality, ability, they don't exist on their own. They all interact, as Crenshaw says, to exasperate each other. So then what does that mean for intersectional environmentalism? Got a quote here from Leah Thomas, who's the founder of the Intersectional Environmentalist platform. Some of you might know them from Instagram. And she describes it as an inclusive version of environmentalism that advocates for both the protection of people and the planet. It identifies the way in which injustices happening to marginalized communities and the earth are interconnected. It brings injustices done to the most vulnerable communities and the earth to the forefront and does not minimize or silence social inequality. Intersectional environmentalism advocates for justice for people and the planet. So like it says here, climate justice is social justice. So that's a kind of introduction bit. Now going to get into introducing our panelists. So we've got Jelly, Jinsella, and Jay today. Oh, Jay names. And I'll stop sharing and let you guys introduce yourselves. So if we could start with Jelly, if you could give us a wee introduction.
Hey guys, my name's Jelly, she, her, and I come from OFN, which is a London-based activism group. We're kind of affiliated to Global Justice Now, but we're our own kind of autonomous little group. We tend to do quite a lot of different actions, so we're not kind of officially, you know, a group for one thing, because we kind of recognize that all our issues are connected, and so we try and fight them strategically. But recently we've been doing workshops called How to Be an Active Anti-Racist in the wake of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. And we started off doing them just kind of open call online. And then we started working with different groups, specifically XR. And because of that, we tailored it a little bit more towards climate justice. And I've been working with a group of like really amazing volunteers doing those workshops. So yeah, that's a bit about me.
Thanks so much. So excited to have you here. All of us at Want Not Waste took the anti-racism workshop a few weeks ago, and it was really amazing. So yeah, Jinsella, could you give us a wee introduction?
Sure. Hi everybody, happy Tuesday and 420. That's another environmental issue that we'll get to. Well, we won't get to this, but another time. Yeah, so I graduated from the University of Manchester a few years ago. During my final year, I set up the campaign against Arms Trade Society after discovering that London hosts one of the world's biggest arms fairs every other year. And then came back to UoM and was even more shocked that they have investments, partnerships, and career collaborations with arms companies. At which point I met Deducation co-founder Melina, and we decided to turn demilitarized education, aka Deducation, into an organization that can stand strong past like campaign handovers at university, you know. So we just got funding late last year, so we're setting up a website and just kind of moving into our next steps of becoming like an affirmed peace organization. So yeah, loads of exciting things going on that we can talk more about later.
Yeah, super exciting. And you guys have got really cool TED Talks on your Instagram and stuff. We talk about a lot of issues. So excited to get into all of that. And last but not least, Jay.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jay. I'm 19. My pronouns are they, them, and I am non-binary and Palestinian. Cross your fingers and make a wish. I'm not a committee member of the University of Manchester Feminist Collective, but they've got me here with their values and a quick message, which is that they are an intersectional feminist society at Manchester University. They work to provide a social space for like-minded university students. They encourage people to engage with intersectional social justice and campaigns against any and all forms of discrimination and oppression. Recent work has included partnering with the Peak Project, starting a university book club, designing a genderless period-themed academic planner, and working with activist Rugiatu Turai to combat FGM in Sierra Leone. To get more involved with their society, or if you're considering running for next year's committee, check out at UoM Feminist Collective on Instagram. As for me, I study social anthropology and Arabic at Edinburgh Uni. I'm a member of Oxford Youth Strike and XR Youth Oxfordshire, so that's Extinction Rebellion Oxfordshire, and I help out sometimes with Fridays for Future or Scottish Youth Climate Strike Edinburgh. And I'm AMAB, so assigned male at birth. I'm privately educated. Both my parents work at Oxford University. I'm white passing and grew up being treated as a white cis male. Normally this kind of information I would call none of your business, but from an intersectional perspective, for me at least, situating myself like this is essential for activism and environmentalism as a whole.
Thanks so much. Those are all great, guys. So excited to have you all here. So we're just going to kick off with a question for all of you. Jinsella, you kind of already answered this, so feel free to kind of not do this. But it's just, how did you get involved in your social justice project or the kind of work that you do? And can you tell us a little bit more about it? Jelly, would you like to kick us off, how you got involved?
Sure, yeah. So I guess I've been involved in activism, I'd say, for about 4 or 5 years. And I'm not going to lie, 50% of the reason I got involved was because they offered free food. But because I wanted to find out more about, you know, I just graduated and I was hearing about, you know, migrants drowning in the crossing from Calais, and I was like, well, that's bad. But I didn't know the full level of how bad it was. So I started getting involved, and I kind of gradually, you know, got to join all the dots between, you know, how you know, climate is driving migrants, how we are militarizing our borders, how you know, how the system treats migrants, and also how it treats people on benefits, and also how it treats any person who's not, you know, a privileged member of the elite, and joined all the dots between things like that. And that's why we kind of campaign on so many different issues. But my heritage is African American and white. And so I know a lot about the kind of American civil rights movement up to present day struggles. So I really wanted to do kind of a bit more kind of anti-racism work and a bit more education work as well. But yes, the social justice work is always you're always learning something. You're always like progressing, always changing your worldview, which is nice or difficult, but important.
Yeah, definitely. I know, Jinsella, you kind of already told us how you got involved, but what was it that actually kind of sparked your interest in the first place? Were you always interested or in like demilitarization stuff, or was it just, like you said, when you found that stuff out in London?
So yeah, I was actually studying fashion marketing, and great time to just shout out Want Not Waste, especially Holly, because I've been making like recycled shotgun shell jewelry and stuff, and we've got like ethically made t-shirts to support Deducation, and Holly and the Want Not Waste community have been repping it and like supporting our development since day dot. So thank you for that. But yeah, I was just fashion marketing, like doing my thing. I'm actually from Devon, and my family are very, very much like farmer community, like, you know, they're very, very interested in conservation. So I've always had an environmental mindset. And then what really moved me into the other issues was seeing the arms fair, and I was just like, what? You know, it was just pure shock for me. And that really opened my eyes up to the level of corruption and the different things which are, you know, building into this. And for me, it was just like, if we're happy to sell weapons to people that we know are going to use them to kill civilians, then that's where we've got to start, because that's just 100% wrong.
It's definitely not something people, I think, are aware of the way they should be. It's so, it's so corrupt. So yeah, I'm excited to get into these discussions. And Jay, how did you get involved in all of your activism and XR and stuff?
Yeah, so I was going through Oxford one day and came across a protest of young people in the middle of Bond Square shouting and sort of waving green things. And I was like, gosh, what's this? What's going on? Grabbed a flyer, and it was Oxford Youth Strike and XR Youth Oxfordshire, I think, together at that point, just doing a protest. And it was inspiring, stuck around for a few minutes, went home, looked them up. Not only were they vocal on the streets, but they were also vocal on social media. So I found an individual's account. This person is called EJ Fawcett. They are amazing. And I messaged, said, hi, can I help? Turned out that I could. Ended up helping with Oxford Youth Strike, ended up helping with XR Youth Oxfordshire, on and off. And we sort of built up a group together a bit more, but it was already sort of absolutely fantastic. And then ended up getting into helping a few European groups who are taking on the coal station Datteln 4 in a movement called Stop Datteln 4. Now that I'm at Edinburgh studying, I'm sometimes helping out with Fridays for Future / school Scottish Youth Climate Strike, Edinburgh, which is really sort of making me look at the divides between student work, as in university student work, and school student work, and how it's totally different between the UK and, you can't really say the rest of Europe at this point, but you know what I mean, where on mainland Europe, so far as I'm told, you actually get collaboration between students and school kids in a way that builds solidarity, helps people with their mental health and this kind of thing, in a way that there isn't here. So just a quick plug, if you're a university student, look up your local school group. Yeah, that's me.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I wouldn't even thought of that kind of thing, actually. Yeah, so these are questions that's kind of open to the three of you. Feel free to jump on each other's answers and stuff. But why is intersectionality so important in environmentalism, and how does the environment intersect with your work?
So, Jelly, we're racing there. But yeah, so basically, I'll just start with the second one, because I think it is the way that the arms trade and militarism interacts with the environment is so fascinating, because it's not just what we see today, but it turns into a bit of a cycle, which I will explain now. So imagine like the supply chain of an arms company, right? You have the intense, highly energy concentrated development of a product. Then you have like the shipment. Then you have like the holding of it, because these are obviously, of course, not all weapons are massive, but a lot of them are absolutely huge and take a lot of maintenance and upkeeping. Then you have the use of the weapon, which of course spreads chaos like there's no tomorrow, including, imagine if a missile broke a sewage system, or collapsed a building. There's chemicals which we can't account for, and debris and waste which is just going everywhere. And one of the links I'm going to show later, we did a series last year called Silent Victim of War, which is the environment, and we speak to one of the founders of the Conflict and Environment Observatory and a veteran, and it's really, really interesting them both talking about the cleanup of war, because of course it doesn't really happen. These environments are so dangerous and chaotic that when you're getting out, and bear in mind when a military intervention like for example, the UK being in Afghanistan happens, they set up whole like disposable homes, like disposable camps, like mini cities where our military will live. Now, when they finally said, right, we got to be out in 3 days, the cleanup isn't done very well. There are, in the videos that I'll share, you'll see that there are some measures, but it's not to the level that we need. Now, not only is this creating a horrible effect on the communities of the affected area, but it's also, of course, contributing to climate change. And as we can all imagine, one of the effects of like climate catastrophes will be resource wars, particularly water. So not only is the military industrial complex, if anyone wants me to explain the military industrial complex, put in the chat and I will do, but I'll just leave it as that for now. Not only is it creating huge carbon emissions, with the US military being one of the biggest single contributors of climate change in the world, but it's also going to accentuate the amount of war we may have. So we get into this spiral of pollution, disaster, chaos, and trauma.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's something that people don't even realize. I think when people think of war, they think of the destruction of places, but not everything that comes before it, and like you say, everything that comes after it in terms of cleanup or lack of. Yeah. And Felix, actually, do you want to take the next question?
Yeah. So obviously, the intersectionality is pretty important in environmentalism, and actually seeing that the upcoming elections, that got us thinking about, okay, so what should we be looking for in local politicians in terms of intersectional environmentalism? So how can people use our vote in that way to, again, this is open to all of you guys.
I think that something which has been really important in Oxford and something which sort of helped build a better lens is we want to be making sure that we're listening to, or we're looking for, people who are listening to and platforming young people, scientists, minorities, making sure that it's not only the vocal ones there who are speaking, but as much room is also being made for people from different cultural backgrounds, people from different languages, maybe people who don't have the skills or the resources or the community support to get their voices out there. Looking for people who aren't complacent in their work is essential, or they're not virtue signaling. So going out and wearing a Black Lives Matter t-shirt at a protest and then going home and never talking to any of the local groups. Hopefully there's a level of tact regarding, I'm sort of going off on a list here, do sort of just put a pin in it if it's not helpful. Treating groups like problematic groups, perhaps like the Socialist Workers' Party, and how they, I'd encourage anyone here to look up Comrade Delta and Martin Smith. It's a really important issue. So how they deal with those groups. Looking to see if the values that the politicians are putting forward are reproduced in their work. And then seeing if they actively engage with other activist groups, seeing if they're seeking to understand whether and why some groups are perhaps not interacting with them. So you look at Extinction Rebellion in this case, who make a point of not talking to local politicians, which is a kind of criticism. So are these politicians open to criticism? Are they going to be replying to the kinds of things that are brought to them? Solidarity with living wage movements. You can go on and on with this. Tell me if it's not helpful. Regarding our votes, it's essential to understand that it's not just our votes that we have. At a local level, we have a huge amount of power to demand concrete policies and promises. So in 2019, Youth Strike and XR Youth, Oxfordshire member EJ Fawcett, single-handedly, basically, organized a hustings that got around 100 people together. Then later in September, Oxford Youth Strike organized a general strike with about 6,000 people coming. So if voters understand that they can incorporate their vote into sort of wider citizenship, seeing themselves as strikers, seeing themselves as activists, making the division there between being an activist and being activist, knowing what they want, turning up to protests, supporting groups online is very important. Yes, I think I went off on a bit of a tangent there, but yes.
Yeah, absolutely agree. It's really important that we find politicians that actually act rather than just all talk. And yeah, so moving on, we'll dive into each of these areas and talk more about how each of these areas intersect with environmentalism. So we'll start off with Jelly. So what does it mean to be anti-racist?
Right, well, this is a very big question. So I think I should start off with like some very important disclaimers. So first of all, we live in a society which is racist. Like there's no getting around that. This is because of systemic racism, cultural representation, even language itself. There's been studies that unconscious racial bias is found in like kids as old as like 3 and 4, who show preferences for different colors. So we are living in this society, we're participating, so we are constantly absorbing racial stereotypes, and obviously depending on our positionality, we'll be affected by them differently, but that is kind of the point of reference. And so I think like one thing I'd like the conversation to change with is like this idea of somebody not being racist, because that is like a judgment against somebody's character, and it defines racism as kind of this interpersonal conflict which might have like racial slurs and these very obvious forms of racism, but it doesn't actually address what racism is systemic. It's part of the culture that we live with. So and that is actually where the groundwork is. Like it's all very good kind of, and then we should report hate crimes against people who are racially abusive, but the what we actually want to do is create system change. And so we need to redefine this idea of racism as it is a systemic problem, which actually affects everybody, whether you're black or white, in a negative way, I think. And so, moving on from this idea of somebody not being racist, like even Donald Trump himself was saying, I'm the least racist person in the room, I'm not racist. He was saying that. And I think it's helpful to say that I am not racist, because we live in a racist society. As I said, we've adopted so many things. And to be anti-racist is, first of all, to recognize the systemic racism in our society. Normally we through kind of opposing racist policies, and by policies I don't necessarily mean political policies by a party. That can be the way that a company recruits staff members, or the way that a university decides what the curriculum is, or who we choose to honour in public monuments, or the way that kids are treated differently, the way the police system is. All these things can be policies, and a lot of these things are racist policies. And so being an anti-racist, we have to oppose racist policies, replace them with anti-racist policies, and therefore society will progress in a more anti-racist way, which is what we want. I would also say that being an anti-racist is it's not useful to see it as an identity, because I'm not a racist thing is an identity signifier. I think it's really useful to think of anti-racism as like an action that we're constantly doing, which just makes us a lot more flexible, because then when somebody challenges us, if somebody says, oh, I don't think you maybe have realized why this is this, or you shouldn't use that word, blah 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 blah, then it's not necessarily attacking your character. It is noticing that we live in a racist world, and that what you did is kind of perpetuating that, and if you changed your actions, then that would help progress things further. So as an anti-racist, we're constantly learning, we're constantly trying to, Angela Davis said this beautiful thing, like freedom is a constant struggle. Like we're always learning better ways to create a world which should be free of oppression. And the most important thing I'd say about anti-racism is actually that it involves all forms of oppression. So you can't be an anti-racist and be heteronormative, and you can't be an anti-racist and be capitalist, because all these forms of oppression, without homophobia, without all these ableism, without all these forms of oppression, then we need to kind of tackle all of them. So there's no getting away from that, and that is why it's so important for the climate movement, because there's absolutely no way that you can have any social movement at all which only tackles one thing, because all these systems of oppression reinforce each other just psychologically. You know, if we're thinking, oh, we're only helping these types of people, but those types of people no, then you just created a new form of other, and that's just going to perpetuate these hierarchies forever. So sorry, I might have gone off on a bit of a tangent, but I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. That's actually really good. Yeah, I know you've touched on it for a little bit. But how do racism and environmental injustice interact specifically?
You can just look at recent events. You know, Priti Patel. She specifically said, you know, in this whole police and crime bill, this whole attempt to, you know, create like this fascist country where protesters are outlawed and all this stuff. You know, she specifically name checked Black Lives Matter and XR. Like, what does that tell us? You know, there is no way that we can have a successful movement for justice, full stop, but especially a climate justice movement, if there's any form of racism in it at all, and which is why we're doing so much stuff with XR. But you know, you really need to be checking the hierarchies you are reproducing in your own movements. So you know, that's just like that's just a strategy thing for our current movement. But in terms of, you know, how race and climate interact, like, you know, there's receipts for that. I mean, just think about, you know, the climate defenders these days, who are majority the people who are on the front line, protecting their homes, protecting their forests, protecting their land, which is about to be made into coal mines or, you know, oil fields or whatever. They are mostly people living in the global south, mostly people of color. And there's absolutely shocking statistics, which I'm trying to find now. Yes. So Global Witness estimated in these people's lives don't matter in our current, you know, levels of hierarchies. And you know, there's so many there's so many examples of this, where you know, multinational corporations take advantage of the global inequalities to create you know, things which accelerate climate change. And a great example is, if anybody's heard of the Ogoni 9 case, that was Shell Oil, you know, working with the British government. So there's legacies of imperialism, colonialism. So this is in the Niger Delta, which is part of Nigeria. And the Ogoni people were kind of the indigenous people there. Shell basically went in, so many oil spills, destroyed their livelihood. You know, they were fishing communities, destroyed the way they could get food and fresh water. You know, they started trying to rebel. What happened was, you know, so much repression. People were displaced, 2,000 people were killed, and the leaders of the rebellion were hung. And that was a kind of sham trial, because it later was found out that Shell Oil had bribed the witnesses to give false testimony. And then, you know, the cases of the Ogoni people, it's still going on in the courts. Like, they just won recently the right to try Shell Oil in London, and that was a huge win for them. These people have been campaigning for decades and decades. And we can see, you know, we'll see with the military as well, so many people are you know, displaced, creating climate migrants, also people losing their you know, losing their crops because of, you know, water changing and all this stuff. And you know, there's estimated to be millions, even billions of climate refugees in the future. And we can see that, you know, all this hyping up of border security, anti-migrant rhetoric, you know, this is all very well planned. I honestly, like, I could go on for about 5 hours about how climate and racism are like, you know, this, but the main point I would like everyone to take home is that we cannot have an effective climate movement, an actual movement which will, you know, really be effective at stopping like catastrophic climate catastrophe, if we are not completely an anti-racist movement.
Yeah, thank you, Jelly. That's really good. Yeah, there's race has a lot to do with environmental movements and how these environmental injustice interacts. You talked a little bit about how basically military race has like the intersection of race and military and also the environment. So I actually want to ask Jinsella about like what is the relationship between war, demilitarization, and also the environment.
So it's huge. Again, I think like even just from our free flowing discussion, you can just hear intersectionality everywhere, right? You know, we know that we are a closed ecosystem, and over the past 30 years, having much easier channels of communication and just like being able to see what's happening across the world like that has really closed up that ecosystem for us and made us really look differently at our kind of nationalist values of protectionism and security, at least for some of us. So what not only does war as a, you know, I think to really get across what I'm trying to get across, we need to just kind of like debunk the fact that war is the best way to solve our security issues in the first place. And this is what Veterans for Peace have as their slogan. It's war does not solve the problems we face in the 21st century. You know, I've spoken to conservative veterans, I've spoken to socialist veterans, all of them. I went to Armed Forces Day and spoke to a 93-year-old like man with badges all down his shirt, and I told him about demilitarized education, and he was like, yes, that's amazing. You know, I was shocked as well. I was just like, okay, cool. You know, the fact that we are so stuck in this idea that we need to use military force to get what we want is completely colonial, and it's a way for us to continue and hang on to our colonial past and our global influence, as we call it. By doing this, you know, capitalism as a self, we can all understand as one of the major givers to climate change, you know, contributors to climate, you know, it's the system we live in, and it's the system which means that we put profit over people and profit over planet. And that is come out of the British and, you know, European colonial past. And militarism is a way that we are hanging on to that and hanging on to our position of hierarchy in the world. Does it actually reflect the security needs that we're trying to tackle? No, it doesn't. And actually, not only does it put British veterans and veterans from wherever in serious trauma and just kind of horrible treatment when they come back to the UK, you know, highest rate of one of the demographics, the highest rate of suicide and homelessness is veterans. But it also has a horrible effect on the environment, as I explained previously, and it has a horrible effect on how we go towards global solutions. This is where I step in and come and tell you that the government is strategizing to try and normalize militarism, because in the early 2000s, the popularity of the armed forces and, you know, militarism in general was very low. We all saw the protests for the Iraq war. There was over like 30 million people worldwide. It was crazy. At the time, the Indian farmers have just knocked that out the park, but at the time it was the biggest protest of all time. Yet they did it anyway. So for us to be able to, for them to be able to get the recruits and maintain support for the military, they had to strategize for these connections in our education. This goes all the way from primary up to the university level, where we are building research and helping advance the military industry. Straight later on tonight, I'm talking at another event about Yemen and the fact that British bombs and British military infrastructure is essential in the damage that we are doing to Yemen. Just one example is the boat which is floating off the port in Yemen, which is full of, I've forgotten exactly how many, but it's on our Instagram, but full of loads and loads of oil. And there's debate over what's going to happen if that, gets shot at, if that just literally cracks because it's been there for so long and spills. That's going to completely kill the ecosystem of that port and prevent fishermen from being able to fish. It's going to prevent any food being able to be brought in because that's the main port that Yemen are using. It just goes on and on and on. The arms trade and militarism not only are just not solutions to the problems we face, but they're accentuating them.
Yeah, certainly it's very problematic that even up to the university level, we're perpetuating this further militarization of the world rather than demilitarization. So I want to know what needs to change within the university politics to actually begin or make demilitarization more effective.
I'm going to jump back on if that's okay. I'm pass it over in a second if anyone else wants to answer that, but I'm sure you guys all just saw at UoM the vote to get Nancy out, right? Which has been ignored. Like, imagine being voted out by your student body and then just staying there like nothing's wrong. That is just a huge indicator that a lot needs to change in the culture. And you think, perfect time to bring up Kill the Bill as well. We're trying to go off of democratic rights and we're upholding democracy and whatnot. The University of Manchester just had a great example of people using their democratic power and it being ignored. This Kill the Bill is another, soon could be another example of that, where our democratic right to protest and speak our mind and fight for what we believe in is going to be squashed in a massive, massive way. So personally, one of the other videos is me actually asking Nancy Rothwell directly in a Q&A, at what point does research and our commercial interests come at a lower importance than human life in other countries? And she says, well, while our government does it, why wouldn't we? And that's fundamental to the thinking at the moment. She's sat in a undemocratically elected lifelong role, yet she's not listening to the people she's supposed to be representing. I guess my suggestions, I really don't know. I was quite hopeful with the referendum. That's something that I've been, even 3 years before this campaign, which saw a successful vote, myself and the BDS, Boycott, Divestments and Sanctions Society, were also doing similar things to ask Nancy Rothwell to stand down, because she clearly just doesn't understand what's going on. I think we just need to keep the pressure up, and COVID has made universities a lot more vulnerable, and I think we just need to use that to put more pressure on until they do actually pay respect to students.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's okay to not know what to do at the moment, but I think certainly just being aware and keep the pressure on towards the uni, and hopefully we can pressure them to make changes. That's really important. And moving on, I'll invite Niamh to invite the FemSoc to actually talk more about their issue.
Yeah, so got a couple questions for you, Jay. Why is it important that environmentalists are also feminists?
So I'm going to say something that might at first sound counterintuitive or controversial. It is important that environmentalists are also feminists, and in some cases it will be crucial to their work. But to say that it is always essential for environmentalists to be feminists, and I do recognize that that's not quite what's being said, that risks stifling a lot of the benefits of intersectionality. So while it's not essential that all environmentalists are also feminists, whatever their labels, their foundations have got to be, if their environmentalism is going to be effective, indistinguishable from foundations that we might call feminist, if their environmentalism is going to be effective. So going to the University of Manchester's Feminist Collective's Instagram page, and if you scroll right down, you'll find a post from their first ever meeting in 2015 with a label saying, "We need feminism because gender shouldn't be an issue." So in environmentalism, what does it look like for gender not to be an issue? What are the conditions necessary for discrimination on the basis of gender no longer to exist, or to be so fiercely mitigated that it becomes a non-issue? In Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, in chapter 5, The Feminism Question, which everybody needs to read, Renée Eddo-Lodge writes, it is a great book. I think feminism has to be absolutely utopian and unrealistic, far removed from any semblance of the world we're living in now. We have to hope for and envision something before agitating for it, rather than blithely giving up, citing reality and accepting the way things are. After all, utopian ideals are as ideological as the political foundations of the world we're currently living in. Above everything, feminism is a constant work in progress. We are all still learning. So the utopia that we have to envision and agitate for has got to hold the foundational understanding of gender in every place our environmentalism reaches. Now, for me personally, one aspect of that means looking at the gendered privileges and discriminations amongst young people and how those are exacerbated and also hidden by sweeping assumptions about race, education, ability, class, accents, especially things like neurotypes. So, for example, if you have ADHD or if you have autism, if you are autistic or have ADHD, how likely it is to impact individuals' limits for burnout, how that combines with the dynamic of special interests, for example. So this is coming out of a conversation with EJ and a they friend Kat. Let's say an autistic person with a special interest just so happens to fit in perfectly with environmental activism. It might be much harder to let go of a particular task or even leave a toxic environment full of microaggressions based on gender and neurotype and race and class and all this, and then rationalize the guilt personally that comes from that, of having to give something up. That kind of thing can be incredibly damaging, and we have to be ready to talk about this and field it as activist groups. Then in other countries, being female and or a woman might hold completely different weights. So last year, Nigerian writer Chidera Ehejirika wrote, "Fuck your gender norms, how Western colonization brought unwanted binaries to Igbo culture." She's drawing off others like Ife Amadiome and tells us about a rich ancient culture where pronouns were gender neutral. And while discrimination based on perceived sex existed, sorry, I've lost my place because I can't read. While discrimination based on perceived sex existed, social categories that the West simply does not have allowed for cultural fluidity of certain roles and, amongst other things, fluidity of power relations. Do stop me if I'm going on for too long. There's a danger here of sort of mystifying this kind of thing and, re-exoticizing Igbo femininity or whatever. And I hope that I'm not doing this. But the point is that this culture and others that differ along the same or different lines are still at play today. Despite globalization, despite colonization, and all the shit that the West has been dumping on other countries for the past 500 years and just never stopped. that's important when you're going in and working with environmental issues, working with the communities that are going to be most impacted by the climate crisis. I hope I'm doing something to sort of signpost the cultural differences environmentalists and feminists will need to be ready to process and to rationalize and be critical of when looking at their own theories that they're bringing to their work, wherever possible, also in the language of those people they're collaborating with is important. Yes.
Yeah, definitely. And I think even just actually leading on from that, how can environmental projects actually perpetuate gender inequality? People aren't thinking about these things, and how can that be addressed?
Right. So in 2008, an academic called Eva Keller at the University of Zurich put out a paper about the Malagasy ethos of life in Massaoala in Madagascar. So she's looking at the ethos of reproduction, of having, so there, and this is coming back to my point about making sure that you're working with individuals' languages. She actually, she's an anthropologist, goes and looks at a story that they have there where when the Malagasy people were asked if they would rather be like a banana tree or like the moon when they die, they say they'd rather be like the banana tree because the banana tree dies and it produces many, many children. So you're actually looking at a cultural myth and understanding what's at the root of people's humanity. So with environmentalists or conservationists there, looking to look after forests there, they actually ended up saying, well, hey, you need to stop cutting down all the trees that you're doing in order to build houses for your children. And this is a massive problem because you're not only coming in and saying, stop cutting down trees, you're not just impacting livelihoods, you're actually attacking directly people's humanities. You are saying you need to rethink being human. And of course, these are going to hold all kinds of different violences regarding your gender in that society, your role, and this kind of thing. So that's incredibly important. Looking at gender, it might feel intuitive to say that those people with the most, so this is going back, I think, more to activist groups, might be intuitive to say that people with the most white or male privilege are going to be the most resilient or the least impacted by microaggressions or this kind of thing. But to say that that's a rule of thumb means that you've possibly misunderstood the work that gender is doing in a group. And again, going back to this point of how many people are, so what's the proportion of environmental activists in the West? Well, it's actually largely female or AFAB, assigned female at birth. It's important thinking about neurotype, again, is incredibly important, how likely people are to let go of work, this kind of thing. And when you're not being incredibly careful, when you're not having a sort of critical safe spaces for these kinds of people, that's when you get splinter groups, that's when you get people burning out, that's when you get, you know, especially under COVID, people with mental health issues suddenly being much harder impacted. Perhaps these people have actually built support networks with other activists that are suddenly cut off because they need to take a step back. So you're getting a mirrored effect. But again, in terms of the climate crisis, we've got to understand continually that while every harm that people have to deal with is very, very valid, there are going to be different roles, and the people who are going to be most impacted are those who contribute least.
Yeah, and exactly. And that's why it's so important for us all to be so aware of intersectionality and then make sure we're being inclusive in that way, because it just becomes a blanket rule for everything and you end up missing out so much that's going on and so much importance in these movements. But that's all of our questions to you guys at the moment. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to hand over to Georgie for our Q&A part of the session.
Great, yes, really great discussions, guys. Let me know, my internet's a bit bad, so let me know if you can't hear me. Cool. So yeah, if anyone wants to type any questions they have for our lovely panelists in the chat, then I'll try and get through as many as we can. We may go a little bit over time. And we've also had a couple of questions from our Instagram. So I'm going to start with that whilst people think about their questions. So our first one, really for anyone to come in and of you three to come in and answer. Why is it important that everyday individuals get involved in social justice issues? And what can individuals do in order to be active intersectional environmentalists? Any of you can really go for it, but
okay, so yeah, I think it's so important that everybody is does something to try and better the world, you know, because science tells us we are literally running out of time. And I think that, you know, young, independent, like millennial Gen Z are killing it already. And I think that everyone is quite comfortable doing it in a way that suits them. I think one thing I would just really, really encourage is expanding your network and reaching out to more people, and just asking more questions, actually, yeah, building your network of people that you can ask when someone does ask you maybe an intersectional question. As Jay so rightly pointed out earlier, it's really important that like the voices that we are representing are actually being platformed rather than, you know, just our own ideas. Of course your ideas can be shared as well, but not when they're being like used in a way to explain someone else's situation. So yeah, that would be my thing, like as just a baseline, keep talking to as many people, make friends online, and yes, neurodiversity, make sure you put all your alt text on Instagram, captions, all of that. Just keep it as inclusive as possible. Be patient with yourself because it's a process. You know, you remember one thing and then you get used to doing that and then you add the next thing on, and that's fine. So just keep going, keep connecting and keep bettering.
Yeah, I just maybe hop in quickly and also say, like, unless you are, I don't know, Bill Gates, unless you're Bill Gates or like the top 10 billionaires, whatnot, the system is built to disadvantage you, and also like just fundamentally like for your soul, for like I do not think that having a worldview which, you know, you are worthy of having billions of pounds while people are starving is good for you. Like, I don't. But yeah, I think that that is why everybody should be an activist, because I just don't think that this system is working for people. It's just not great. And fundamentally, I think we'd all, you know, we want to create a world where everybody can live a purposeful, happy life, you know, just filled with like love and sunshine and whatnot. And the world is not built like that at the moment. And but what we really need to do is not feel discouraged, disempowered, that we have our power taken away from us, because that's exactly what the system, you know, facilitates. But, you know, we really need to find, you know, strength in the community, joy in activism. You know, people don't chat about that enough. And I saw a little question about burnout, but you know, that, you know, activism is hard. You know, it's extra stuff to do in a society which works us, you know, to death. But you know, there should be joy in activism. There should be like community in activism. There should be love and creativity and passion in activism. Like, it's not just like, you know, rah, and who was the person who said, if there isn't dancing in my revolution, I'm not part of it, kind of thing. So yeah, with the burnout thing, like, your activism can take any form you want. Yeah, sure, marches are important, talks are important, educating yourself, doing the work is important, but you know, why can't you be dancing at your marches? Why can't you be educating yourself with really interesting talks? Why can't you be, you know, educating yourself with discussions by amazing people who inspire you, and you know, you have a great time. So yeah, activism should be fun and is essential so that we're happier as people and create a better world. So, and bring music to protest 100%. Find the samba band at any protest and you'll have a good time. Yeah. We know.
Love that. Great answers from both of you. We have another question from Instagram here, which is, what is the relationship between intersectionality and veganism? And that could be potentially kind of the dismissal of indigenous practices by white vegans, perhaps, or also maybe the interaction with colonialism and veganism. If maybe Jelly, you might want to jump in on that, or any of you.
I'll just say a quick thing. I've been vegan for like 4.5 years, and I love it. You know, I went from like proper, as I said earlier, community, which is like not. My mum literally laughed in my face when I told her I was getting vegetarian. It was so funny. And yeah, you know, I've had conversations with like British farmers about veganism, and yeah, they fully understand it. Again, like obviously they don't, it's not plausible for them because they have their business and they need to maintain it. And I think it's impossible to, you know, I personally as a vegan, you keep it quite personal, and I share my thoughts and feelings on why I do it, environmentalism, animals, health, so on. And I am privileged enough to be able to make that clean cut and make those choices without it. I don't know, I'm just privileged enough to do it without it being serious stress. People in other parts of the world and also in the UK, such as the cow farmer, don't. This is like what's the word? It's like generational skills that they've learned and that they've built, and without the correct subsidies to support change, it's not going to happen. So I think that my perspective on it is like, it's completely intersectional, it's completely personal. And I think until there's like general support for the people at the other end of the effects of veganism, it shouldn't be like forced. And that's actually something I wanted to say as well, just on intersectionality in general. You know, activists aren't perfect, and I think it's our responsibility to learn as we go and not be like this is 100% sound about things, but more go forward with like an adapt and evolve kind of mentality and make people aware of that. Because otherwise, when we're saying, you know, this is the only way, we're not opening our minds and eyes up to the negative effects that may create. Because of course everything we do does have some form of negative impact, and we need to be aware of that as much as we're aware that the positive impact may outweigh that in a big way.
Yeah, very well said. Very well said. Go on, Jay.
Possible to make a quick, yeah. So it's really interesting that someone mentioned sort of the roots of veganism. I think when we presented the question, when I spoke to my dad, who's 70, about going vegan and about having vegan friends, he said, "Oh, you mean veganism?" And it's there's a massive history behind it, which I would not dream of trying to talk to people about, because it's interesting and important to many people's lives. Do go and look it up, do seek to understand where this and other things go on. And there's an important point there. A huge amount of indigenous knowledge that goes into conservation practices, a huge amount of activism that goes on in countries that one couldn't place on a map and this kind of thing. Especially if you are an activist, but absolutely everyone should be seeking to seek out where these knowledges come from and try to understand, if they can, the harm that can be done by skating over the origins and by sort of doing what is essentially appropriating a lot of things without paying their dues to their origins.
I actually just thought of an important point. So there's this, you know, like I think one of the main motivations for veganism, like there's a lot of people do it for different reasons, but one of the main ones is this idea of, you know, like, you know, animal cruelty being built into the way that we, you know, consume animal products. But I just think that we need to be thinking the food system in general has cruelty built into it, and we often forget the human cruelty built into things. For example, fruit pickers in different countries, sometimes having poisonous fumes from pesticides while they're picking crops, working crazy hours, and obviously mostly like migrant workers, no workers' rights, and obviously the environmental impacts. But sometimes crops are shipped from the other side of the world, whereas other produce is locally produced. So it's that's not like a straightforward answer, but it's just having a slightly wider view of where is cruelty full stop coming from in the food production system, because that is slave labor, that is exploitation, there's so much cruelty built into the whole food production system, and that's not that is sometimes this thing of like talking about animal cruelty and for ignoring that human cruelty, and it's mostly black and brown people, migrants. That is a really bad thing to do. And also there's cruelty built into clothes manufacturing and so much stuff, and it's just becoming a little bit more aware of the systems which are in place, I think, when we're talking about this, and just having a little bit more of an understanding about how we get the products we have in the Western world, and at what cost and to whose cost. But yeah, so that's not a comment on like it's bad to be vegan, like obviously not, but it's just having a little bit of an awareness when we're talking about things such as cruelty and environmental impact, that there's a huge amount of stuff behind that as well.
Yeah, 100%. Understanding the complexities of environmentalism in general is completely essential into actually achieving anything. We have a question here about neurodivergency, and the question is how can we make our activism and spaces and tools more accessible, considering neurodiversity? I think, Jinsella, you picked up on it a bit already, but perhaps we could discuss it a little bit more in detail.
So I basically, as I think it was Niamh, I've forgotten exactly, but someone said earlier, I every week I run a talk show called Dead Talks, and 2 weeks ago I spoke to a young man who has neurodiversity in a few ways, and he just fully opened my eyes up to the crazy things I've been going through, from simply just having to have the struggle you go through having to get a card which properly registers your disability, and that has put him into homelessness, out of education. Sorry, I should have said those the other way around. Out of education, which led him into homelessness, and he's been fighting to get his right to education back since, and he's 25 now. And from research and getting that, this happens when kids are like 6 years old, and they're being excluded from school because they don't have the right card or whatever that actually indicates why they might be a little bit disruptive or be thinking differently in class. So yeah, go check out our IGTV and watch that talk, because he's really, really inspiring, and he's running a campaign at the moment which is asking government to reform special educational needs. So yeah, support that. When it comes to just general activism, I think it's difficult, don't get me wrong. It takes time, you're like, okay, just quickly get a social media post up. No, it's never quick just getting a social media post up. Like, you have to do alt text, you have to make sure the captions are on, you have to like reread it, make sure you're not just writing garbage. So it takes time. However, again, I think it's just a habit people need to get into. I I will try and think now while I stop talking about a good place to look for resources on that.
Would it be okay to drop in something there? It's, again, if we're coming from an intersectional perspective, it's absolutely essential to understand that however someone is neurodivergent, it's going to be totally mixed up in their upbringing, in their class, in their gender, in their race. And so I had an in-depth discussion with my They friend Kat and with EJ Fawcett, who is an excellent activist. You should go and follow because they're fantastic. So just reading out some notes that I actually took from that conversation. AFAB people, assigned female at birth, may be taught from a young age that their needs aren't important, and that acting out in a way that's actually sort of pushed by, say, if you have ADHD, if you're autistic, that's being pushed by that, is something that is pushed down by parents who either are just sort of prejudicial and bigoted in their own ways, or are looking at you and saying, I don't want my child to go into a hostile environment of a school and have to deal with being bullied for this and this and this and this. So that kind of thing can actually, children, absorb directly what's being told to them, and that kind of thing can mean that you're internalizing everything, and the kinds of aggression and hate for a system, a very strong word, but for a system which is hurting you, ends up actually getting internalized and pushed into you and becoming something where you are actually doing violence towards yourself. And again, this is going to be totally exacerbated by your race and your class, your ability, all these kinds of things. You might find yourself sort of less able to put up boundaries. This will come into activist circles, especially, where you might find that you sort of can't click with other people. You're not on the same social scripts as other people. You don't know quite how to react if someone says, well, you're just being a dick, because they are sort of carrying out microaggressions without realizing it. Is again, where it's really important to have sort of critical safe spaces where you're understanding that everybody's going to be coming into something with their own traumas, but also with their own prejudices, and making sure that everybody understands, I am going to be doing violence unless I am sort of fielding this kind of thing. I'm waiting for other people to catch it. Unless everybody's sort of doing that mutually, everybody's at risk. And again, I saw something in the chat about how that might impact marginalized communities. Well, think about climate migrancy. Think about climate apartheid, which is, it's already a reality. It's going to be getting worse and worse. What do you think are the priorities of the people who are having to move miles and miles, or across massive bodies of water, looking after their children and their families as much as they can? It's not going to be, as little priority is going to be put on sanitary projects for women, as on neurodivergency, as on the ways that people are vulnerable to trauma. So again, when you're in crisis, these things are going to be massively exacerbated and just pushed to the side, either because people don't understand them or they don't have the time or resources to deal with them.
Amazing. Thanks so much, guys. That's probably all we're going to have time for, so I'm just going to hand you back to Niamh.
Yeah, that's actually amazing, guys. I feel like I've learned a lot, but thank you so much for being here. I know we've run over a little bit, but it's worth it. It's fine. And if anyone did have to dash off, or you've gone away and come back, everything will be on YouTube in a few days, so don't worry about it. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you to all our panelists, to Jelly, Jinsella, and Jay. We've got here, I'm going to actually pop in the chat the links to the slides if people want to look through the slides, because we've got everyone's Instagram for What Not Waste, Our Future Now, Deducation, UoM Feminist Collective, and that's also Jay's Instagram in there. And we've just got a very, in comparison to what it could be, a very short resource list on a few things about intersectional environmentalism. I feel like we could have actually spoken for about 5 hours here with all the things. There's so much to go into, but thank you so much. We did a wee survey, just if you follow the QR code. It only takes a few minutes. If you do have the time, we'd really appreciate it if you could fill that out so we can get some feedback for future events. But yeah, that's pretty much everything. So thank you guys so much for coming. And thank you again to our lovely panelists and to Georgie and Felix. I hope everyone's had a nice time, and yeah, hope you all have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.
This was really fantastic. Thanks so much.
Yeah.